All right, so as Alejandro said, my previous big project was a study of, to a certain extent, the commercialization and industrialization of newspaper production and the consequences that this had for relationships within the newsroom, between journalists and newspaper owners, and then within the public at large, and as well as the officials in the Argentine state. So this might seem completely and totally distinct. But one of the reasons that I started looking at Spiritism was that I kept coming across it in my work in Argentine journalism. The person who wrote the polemic that I'll be focusing on was a co-founder of the newspaper La Prensa, which until it was taken over by the Peronist government was the economically most powerful newspaper in the world outside of the United States. And then it was expropriated by Perón in 1951. A number of newspaper owners and their families were also involved either in the type of Spiritism that I'm going to be talking about, or in some other sometimes hodgepodge of esoteric traditions. And so in much of my previous research, I kept coming across what I felt were irrelevant to not really relevant to the basic text I was writing, but made for, I thought, really interesting footnotes. And so I'm not exactly turning the footnotes of that book into this one, but what it did sort of drive home to me was something that I already knew, which is that in Argentina there are essentially two things that you can't, well, at least two things that you can't escape. But of the things that you can't escape, there is Freudian psychoanalysis, and then some type of esotericism, and in a significantly less coherent way in the 21st century and the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, than it was at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which is where I'm focusing. So with that preface, I want to thank the philosophy department, thank the organizers, Ivan and Alejandro especially, as well as all of the other sponsoring departments that the list, I was a little bit lost on the list, but it was extensive, so thank you. And I also, in particular, want to thank the organizers for both looking beyond their own discipline and at the same time putting me in a position where I have to do the same, right? And I think that's really healthy. It can be awkward at times, but I think it's really, really healthy, both for people involved in particular work to be figuring out ways in which you can make it speak or be relevant to people in other disciplines. And then also, I think it's a good idea that people in other disciplines, that in a variety of disciplines, are always exposed to the approaches of other disciplines. And this is essentially, this whole prelude is part of what we do as historians. We situate the particular text that we're looking at. In this case, the talk that I'll be giving here. What are the conditions of its production? That's a big part of the conditions of its production. So what I'm doing is I'll be looking at, the talk is based on work in progress. And in fact, it's work that's really in its initial stages. I had finished one large project. I had sort of been fiddling around with two smaller ones that are in various stages of organization and writing. And this, when I got the invitation from Ivan, this was sort of the push that, together with a bunch of documents that I received, was the push to really start organizing and working through this material on this larger project. So specifically, the talk is on the conflicted relationship that adherents of Spiritism and a particular form of Spiritism, which I'll be clarifying later on. But the conflicted relationship that adherents of Spiritism had with a fundamental, if not hegemonic, current within Argentine social thought in the final decades of the 19th century, in the first decades of the 20th century, and this is Comtean positivism, and its sort of various derivatives within Argentina inspired by the writings of Comte and then particular practices within Argentina. And when Ivan asked me what I wanted to do, and I sort of at one point flippantly said something along the lines of, I'll talk about the illegitimate child of positivism. And not really thinking that it was kind of a cute metaphor. And then when I started preparing the talk, and I selected the document that I thought would be most appropriate to focus on, it turns out that I wasn't the only one who thought of that metaphor. The author of the polemic uses the metaphor of Spiritism as being the child, the offspring of positivism, although not the illegitimate child. So there are a number of things that drew me to this topic, and I sort of want to take out two that I think are most relevant to understanding my particular interest in Spiritism, or my somewhat instrumental use of Spiritism to get at some other issues. And the first of these is that I'm interested in how common sense is formed. That is, I'm interested in how the ingrained assumptions of how the world works are shaped, how they change, how they're contested, what are the particular conflicts out of which a common sense emerges. And in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, science had a huge influence on the shaping of people's common sense. The language of science sort of began to permeate everyday language, and you can see this in writings in newspaper. You can see this in works of theater. Later on, you can start to see it in tango, and a fascination with technology, film, radio. So I'm curious then how, more specifically, science helped to shape the common sense of people in turn of the century Argentina. And so that particular moment, going from about 1870 through to about 1920, was a moment in which the impact of science and technology was utterly transformative. It was utterly transformative. It was also utterly transformative very specifically in the city of Buenos Aires, which has astronomical rates of growth in demographic terms, but also in economic terms in that period. So the time and the place seemed really appropriate for this type of work. More broadly within that, one of the things that I'm interested in, one of the directions that this might take, is a kind of illegitimate child of the history of everyday life, and this would be a sort of history of everyday death. That is,